Okay, let's get going. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to Bardia Perry. On behalf of Bardia Perry, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel session, Health and Life Sciences, Research Integrity Under the Microscope. For those I haven't met, my name is Gavin Stewart. I head up our disputes and advisory team and also the firm's fraud and corruption capability. I'm also a certified fraud examiner, and I believe we have some other CFEs with us today. Thanks for coming along. A bit of housekeeping before we get going, as always. Amenities are located just out near reception to the left. Remember to turn your mobile phones to silent. Happy to have people taking photos and liking and sharing content though. We are doing this as a hybrid event today. So we have some people in the room here. We have more people, many more people online. So just bear that in mind if you are in the room. So when we get to questions, there will be questions coming perhaps from the online attendees and also in the room. And lastly, we do have refreshments. So if you can stay and have a drink and have a chat afterwards, that'd be great. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I extend my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So, Bardia Perry's Fraud and Corruption Group was launched in early 2023 and comprises partners across the firm in all of our areas of expertise, so we can provide holistic legal services. Since then, the group has acted in high-stakes fraud and corruption matters for a broad range of clients, including local government bodies, health service professionals, education institutions, high-profile brands, and not-for-profits. There is no escaping the fact that fraud incidents are increasing, and that's one of the reasons why we set up the focus group here at Bardia Perry. Our topic today will explore how this is playing out in the health and life sciences sector. And I wanted to open the session by setting the scene and providing context of the current landscape. So health and life sciences is rapidly emerging as a major sector in the Australian economy, driving innovation, advancements in medical treatment and the diversification of our economy. Australian companies such as CSL and Cochlear are recognised as global leaders, and there is an increasing pipeline of emerging players entering the sector. Australia's research and development expenditure sits at around 45 billion annually, and the Commonwealth is investing more than 15 billion across a wide range of programs, and around 1.8 billion in new grant funding each year. The broader sector is equally substantial, with education exports valued at about 52 billion and the pharmaceutical industry at around 24.7 billion. The recent federal budget also included some high-profile announcements, including 387 million in additional funding over the forward estimates for the CSIRO, a commitment to increase the Medical Research Future Fund towards $1 billion per year beyond the forward estimates, and the proposed National Resilience and Science Council to improve coordination across what is now more than $15 billion in annual government research and innovation investment. As the sector has attracted greater recognition and funding, the incentives have increased. There is a clear commercial and professional driver to secure funding, achieve commercialisation, and demonstrate results, which in turn creates conditions for misconduct, which is what we're here to talk about today. The nature of that misconduct is often different to what might traditionally be understood as fraud. In this context, it tends to manifest as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, which are, of course, wrongs that nevertheless involve dishonesty. Misconduct in this context can translate directly into commercial risk, undermining the credibility of products and research, misallocating funding, and exposing organisations and individuals to regulatory action, including possible criminal sanctions, legal proceedings, significant financial loss, and most commonly, serious reputational damage. Once confidence in underlying data is lost, it can result in product withdrawal, loss of market trust, and long-term harm to the business that is difficult to reverse. Australia has, in large part, addressed these issues through the use of a self-regulatory framework rather than top-down oversight. There is no dedicated independent national body tasked with investigating research misconduct. But as we'll hear today, that model has been subject to recent criticism, including on the basis of limited transparency, the potential for conflicts of interest, and the absence of independent oversight. So with these things in mind, let me introduce our panel who are going to lead the discussion today. Immediately to my right is Dennis Feeney. Dennis Feeney is the founder and director of Venture Technology Group, a life sciences consultancy that works with collaborative partners to support the translation, development, and commercialization of drug, device, and diagnostic assets globally. He brings extensive executive and non-executive director experience across private pharmaceutical affiliates and Australian biotechnology companies, with a strong track record in capital raising, development deals, grant funding, and stakeholder engagement. His expertise spans discovery, partnerships, clinical research, regulatory affairs, medical services, and market access. Dennis also co-founded an Australian biotechnology startup with global potential in human and animal health, and served as an industry mentor at the University of Sydney Business School. He holds a Master of Science from the University of Western Australia, Certificate of Health Economics from Monash University, and a PhD in Medicine from the University of Sydney. Glenn Sung, who's in the middle of our panel, is a pharmaceutical professional with over 35 years experience in regulatory affairs, new product development, medical affairs, and business development, having worked for companies including Schering-Plough, Wyeth Pharmaceuticals, and Mundi Pharma. He has demonstrated leadership skills and a proven track record of success in developing innovative regulatory strategies leading to global business expansion in Europe, Canada, China, Asia, and the Middle East. Glenn is passionate about creating a diverse and inclusive environment and driving innovation regulatory strategy where people can work together to transform the lives of patients. And on the end is our own Michael Cassetto, partner in our corporate and commercial team. Michael has over 30 years experience acting for universities, large companies, government bodies, private businesses, and not-for-profits across a range of corporate and commercial legal transactions. He has a special interest in licensing and distribution, as well as a deep understanding of intellectual property law, having previously worked at IP Australia as a patent examiner. This includes providing advice on managing intangible assets and commercializing technology. So, with that introduction, let's jump into it, as they say. So, the first thing we thought we'd talk about is ramifications, I suppose, or what can happen where what we're going to term third-party data may lack integrity, and it is then used by entities in this health and life sciences space. And we're going to do that by looking at sunscreen, which recently has come under scrutiny in Australia. There was a choice, some choice testing and a report done in 2025 about sunscreens for sale in Australia, which some people may know about. And it found major gaps between the sun protection factor that was advertised and the actual results of testing of those products. In some instances, sun protection factor of 50 plus, returning results of 4. So if you're a parent putting sunscreen on your child, hoping that they're going to have 5 hours worth of protection in the sun, and they only have, what's that, 1/15 of that, that's a real concern. Now, hot off the press, it's been reported that, this is late March 2026, that the TGA has announced consultation on proposed reforms to sunscreen regulation, manufacturing and testing as a result of the choice investigations done last year. So what we're talking about then in broad terms is a situation where perhaps without any knowledge of any lack of integrity in the particular sunscreens that are being sold or the product that is being sold, and no at the outset intention or dishonesty on the part of whoever's selling them, issues that may arise for them. So I'm going to now throw to the panel and start asking some questions and ask the panel just to assume, so we have an entity it's decided to acquire sunscreen from somewhere that's been manufactured by someone else, place it in bottles, put some labeling on it, make some claims as to its SPF and other things, and put it into the market in Australia. So I suppose I'm going to ask a very simple question. How can it be that you can end up in a situation where you have a product marketed and sold in Australia as having an SPF 50 plus and failing so miserably on that test? Is it a complicated process, or is it a very straightforward process that leads to the sale of this product?
It's not a complicated process. Just basically, you need to establish a contract with the manufacturer or supplier of the product. However, I think in doing this, you need to conduct your own audits of the facilities, making sure that you've got compliance to the standards and you meet those standards. And they have the testing equipment and the capabilities of testing these products.
So you're suggesting that you need to actually go in and do your own independent auditing, testing, checking. Is that how it works from a legal perspective, Michael? How the contracts are set up?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong, I think, with relying on a third party to provide some services to you, right? So I think, you know, it's quite common in the in this particular industry that you have a third party manufacturer manufacturing the sunscreen, and it's also quite common that you would have a third party person to test the SPF factor, right? So that's something that's quite common. And because you can't have all that technical expertise within your own organisation, so you always have to outsource some of that. And I agree with Glenn. I mean, one of the main things that you have to do is just do some basic DD, right? Some due diligence. You need to understand who you're contracting with. That is particularly important in the life sciences sector, because you are dealing with products that have an impact on people's bodies and their health. And so it is something that is, I think most people in the industry, you know, have a pretty high standard, and they do that quite well. But you do need to need to look under the hood. You probably need to go, you know, and I don't think it's just a case of, I mean, sure, you need to check credentials, but you also need to go and, you know, maybe visit the facilities, have a look at the facilities and that kind of thing. So it goes a bit deeper.
So you need to do more than just rely upon some documentary certification.
I would think so.
Of a batch of testing or something.
I would. Yeah, definitely.
And you would build that into the contracts.
Well, I don't know. I think in my mind, a lot of that happens before you get to the contract.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can certainly put some things into the contract, but you want to be looking at that stuff before you even get there. Because I think that's just part of vetting and selecting the supplier who's going to provide that, whether it be the manufacturer or the testing house.
Okay. Dennis, you wanted to?
This matter was brought to attention by Choice Magazine and by the ABC. And I was just looking to check and see if the TGA maintained that it didn't have the capacity to do the testing. Is that right, Glenn, do you think? For sunscreens, that they relied on their contractual relationships and what was certified in supplying these into the marketplace.
Yeah, that is correct, because the regulatory person who signs the documents are legally also responsible for the responsibility of the products that's been registered. So it's to ensure that the TGA won't be able to test every single product on the market, and it's based upon risk, right? So your prescription products has the highest risk, okay? Listable products like sunscreens generally should be classified as a low-risk product. That's why they're called listable products, okay? But really, this has turned it upside down in the sense that we audit clinical trial sites for prescription products. We go in and audit ourselves, make sure there's ethics committee's approval, we audit the data. But do we do it for these listable products like sunscreens?
So can you explain to me how how it actually works then. So if there's a third-party manufacturer of sunscreen in this instance, is that sunscreen something that has obtained some level of TGA approval?
You used approved ingredients, you use approved claims, you have to provide the approved SPF certificate, and then you list it with the Australian government.
And that's
TGA.
that's the third-party manufacturer that does all of that.
Or the sponsor that sells it in Australia.
Or did you say?
Yeah, or the sponsor that sells it in Australia. It's generally the sponsor that
So
sells it.
then once that all happens, and let's say it's the sponsor that does that, and then we have a problem in that someone gets incredibly burnt one day because they've applied the sunscreen that the sponsor thought had a 50+ SPF and it only had a 4 SPF. Who's responsible for that?
Well, the sponsor in Australia, this more a legal question, which I'll pass over to Michael, but the sponsor has the responsibility for managing the adverse situation and the product in Australia because they're responsible. They have the legal responsibility. But I'm going to pass the next ball over to Michael.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I think in that scenario, the sponsor will have a certain degree of responsibility, right? But whoever is importing the product, and it doesn't always have to be the sponsor, but it often is. They, under the consumer law, for example, they would be responsible, primarily responsible. So as a sponsor, if you are a sponsor for a product like a sunscreen in Australia, and the product is being manufactured perhaps by someone overseas, then you would definitely want to have some kind of contractual rights in that supply arrangement so that you can shift liability to that manufacturer. I think in the case in a lot of the examples of the choice and the TGA, this particular thing with the sunscreen, my understanding is that there were a number of manufacturers that are based in Australia who are producing the sunscreens, but a lot of them did use the same testing house, which was located overseas. Now, I think in this kind of scenario, I would think that it's the manufacturer who gets the product tested. It could be the sponsor of the product who needs some things. They might go off and get independent testing. But I know that because, we act for some brand owners who have sunscreen products. And when this occurred, obviously there was a little bit of concern because I know that some of them used the same testing house. That was the subject of the inquiry, right? So there was concern, but they rely on the manufacturer to have had the product tested, right? And it's the manufacturer who's then providing a dossier of information, which they then use as a sponsor of a product, which is then registered with the TGA. Yeah.
So at some point in this chain, someone's produced information that's incorrect.
Sure. Well, one of the things I guess with this particular instance is that I don't think the TGA actually yet knows exactly why the results are different to what was mentioned on the product. So that's still the subject of investigation, and it could well be that it's just the methodology, because one of the things that the TGA has kind of come out and said is that that a part of the consultation that you mentioned before was that they were asking people to provide comment on the methodology of determining the SPF factor, because my understanding is, and Glenn, you might be able to talk to this maybe more, or Dennis, my understanding is that a lot of it is done with actual human subjects, right? So it's someone kind of applies the sunscreen onto someone's skin, and then they stick it under a heat lamp or a sun lamp for a particular period of time, and they kind of then determine how burnt the person has got, right? So it could be the methodology that is flawed, not necessarily that the data was manipulated. So it really depends. Yeah, I don't know whether Dennis and Glenn had insight into what happened.
So it sounds like you have legal responsibility on the entity that's imported and sold in Australia, and then behind that, it's all a bit murky as to who's done the wrong thing and how and why. And
well, I think, I mean, sorry, I think, you know, as a sponsor, you'll definitely have a responsibility.
Yeah.
And you should get insurance. That's probably the number one thing. You know, if you're going to import a product or have a product, particularly for like a sunscreen product, you'd want to be having some kind of product liability insurance. But, you know, you can try and protect yourself contractually, but that will only go so far because not everyone in that supply chain is prepared to take the risk.
Yeah.
Right. And someone who's testing may not necessarily be prepared to take risk for product liability. The manufacturer, depending on the circumstances, may not necessarily take that risk as well. But anyway.
okay, the point is well made. Dennis?
I think the TGA has taken a decision to think prospectively about this rather than retrospectively. A consultation process and an education process rather than a coercive process. Although the TGA has amplified its focus on coercive outcomes rather than educational and guiding ones towards compliance. They have definitely done that. But with respect to this, my understanding is that they're taking a sort of an educational approach and trying to avoid these deficiencies happening again in the future. That's my understanding.
So it's possible to win back the trust of the regulator then, if something like this happens. Is it fair to say?
I think so, because I think the TGA objective is always ensuring quality and safety of products to the Australian consumers. And they're the two fundamental pivots which controls the regulations in Australia. And so in this case, we have a quality and safety issue, melanoma being the safety issue, sunburn, and we got a quality issue, which is that the product's not providing the SPF claim. And so the TGA is reviewing every aspect of the sunscreen regulations and what reforms are needed to make the changes in order to protect the Australian public.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you think that the TGA is doing that, though, retrospectively, to try and avoid the spotlight being on the fundamental deficiencies in not taking a coercive approach as opposed to the mitigating? Because ultimately, this is an item which is regulated, and you now have an issue where you have a product out on the market that could potentially cause safety issues, and there's a potential for there to be an issue for the TGA from an optics perspective.
I've had a lot to do with the TGA and the prescription medicines arena. I think Glenn said the sunscreens are listed as opposed to registered. And my understanding is that that is really the lowest level of regulation that the TGA can really offer. So Glenn has already mentioned that the TGA wants to be and be seen to be a reputable, trustworthy organisation where the community can rely on their decisions. And I strongly suspect, not being an expert in this field, that they were a bit blindsided by this outcome. They hadn't tested for it, they weren't expecting it, and now they are trying to recover and represent an influential and trusted perspective in the community, and also with the trying to get the manufacturers to do a better job.
Okay, thank you.
I think also, sorry, Gav, I think, the saying, one bad apple doesn't spoil the whole group. I think in this case, we've got one bad apple which spoiled the whole group. And because it became such a public issue in the press, okay, action does need to be taken. And looking at the new standards, how do we improve? Okay, and even though it's a listable and considered as a low-risk product, it's how do we improve the regulations, right? Rather than seen as enforcing more difficult regulations that industry has to overcome. And I think this is the purpose of consultation. It's what is the balance of it, the balance between the regulations, the safety and quality of products.
Okay, thank you. We might move on to another topic because we only have limited time today. I want to just now have a look at, so we just talked about where an entity's used a third-party manufacturer, product in that context. I want to just talk about now where an entity is selling products into the market and itself is managing the process of the integrity of the clinical and manufacturing data and information. So there's been a couple of, there's been a number of examples. Quite an egregious example here is Ranbaxy, where an Indian-based generics manufacturer made certain claims and representations to the US government in relation to programs that it was supplying generics for, as to the strength, purity, quality specifications of its products. And it was found that they were deliberately falsifying testing and manufacturing data that was submitted to the regulators. Now, that entity ended up copying significant criminal and civil penalty criminal fines and civil penalties of $500 million. So how is this? It's obvious it's different, I suppose, but perhaps Glenn, do you have anything to say about this context in terms of where liability sits here, responsibility, how you can get to a situation where this can actually happen?
I guess, like in terms of the products, Ranbaxy is responsible because they were the sponsor and an owner of the product, which they marketed in the US. The FDA generally does do also audits of the companies, and that's, I guess, where the data discrepancies started being discovered, which led to further investigations. There was significant recalls of Ranbaxy products, and it started in the US and it ended up around the world because even Australia had Ranbaxy generics. And so there was significant recalls because there was a major safety issue. They didn't prove bioequivalence to the originator product. So it wasn't equivalent. So there was major concerns on safety. There was also then the issue of the fines which they had, felony charges, the $500 million in fines. So Ranbaxy actually went bankrupt in the end as an organization which was sold numerous times. But the question is it worth to jeopardize people's safety and life over these type of issues? The company was interested in rapid expansion. And so was it the commercialization objectives that overrode the decision of ethics in doing the right thing?
And my understanding is that the company went to the lengths of saying that factory over there is going to produce the products, and you can see that it's a clean factory and it's producing results under testing that are within the specifications, but then they actually manufactured them at a different factory that was not meeting specifications. That's pretty sophisticated fraud, really, and I can't think of any other way to put it. So you talked about how Ranbaxy ended up going bankrupt and paid the fines. Did anything happen in relation to the directors of that company or the owners or any managers involved? So when I say how does this happen, I appreciate it's all in-house, but what would you expect to see in terms of auditing, in terms of quality assurance, product control, all these different things that would have to be going on inside the organisation and would be, you would think, asked about by, in this case, the FDA?
Well, a lot of this is actually built into what we call good manufacturing practice guidelines. And these are guidelines that the manufacturer has to meet in order to obtain a license for their facility to manufacture these products. So I guess the only way the FDA was able to pick up these discrepancies was through their audits. And that's why governments audits, and even the TGA audits manufacturing facilities. They look at documentation, they look at processes, they look at your process flows, SOPs, to ensure that you're doing the right thing. Okay, so I guess Ranbaxy was caught, but in terms of the repercussions to the owners of the organization, I pass that on to Michael.
Well, I might talk about something different.
What would you?
Well, I'm just wondering. I mean, you kind of mentioned, or asked the question a bit about why or how this might have happened, and with a lot of businesses that are involved in life sciences, I like to think that they generally have really good governance and audit structures in place. So you would usually see that there would be some kind of internal audit function within a business in the life sciences space. And the role of that internal audit, is to test the procedures, to test the standard operating procedures, to, ensure that there's a good audit trail of data and process, right? So usually when a regulator gets involved is when that internal audit process has failed in some way. And so I think that's probably, I'm not quite sure what happened in this particular instance, but you would think that their internal audit was probably not up to scratch, and I'm not quite sure why. Perhaps it was, from the top, where they kind of overlooked anomalies, or they didn't have the right structure to escalate issues.
Would you expect the regulator to require, assume for the moment the company doesn't go, become insolvent and disappear, and it's dealing with the regulator, would you expect the regulator to impose on the company requirements to improve and to demonstrate that it's improved its internal audit and quality assurance process?
Yeah, I think that could be one of the corrective actions that they impose, or one of the conditions, because one of the things that the TGA can do, and I imagine it's the same with the FDA in the US, that they can impose conditions on a sponsorship, right? So if you're the sponsor of a product and then there's an issue, then they can impose some conditions, and it could be that you put in place a better internal audit function, and training and other things like that.
Because this, to me, this seems like a pretty systematic fraud perpetrated by the entire organisation from the top down. To go to the extent of having this factory used to produce products, but we're reporting this one is actually
You'd expect more than one person knew.
Yes, and yet the reporting is, and I wasn't involved in the case in the States, but the reporting is that the company copped fines, $500 million, but there's no reporting around directors or anyone else being prosecuted or held to be responsible. So I just find that interesting. I'll leave that hanging there for the moment. Have we had anything similar to that in Australia? Any situations like that?
I've had the personal experience, and this is where it comes from. How we say trust your instincts, right? We've always got that gut feeling that something's not right, like jumping off this building, it's not right, okay, and you won't do it, or there's something that's inkling in your stomach saying there's something wrong in this. I had this experience, and the business actually requested me to review a potential manufacturer and to improve the brand cost of goods, as well as broaden the product range. The secondary objective was to look at globalizing the product into Asia. There was already a number of local companies working and selling these products in Australia. So the company gave us a tour of the laboratories, and I noted the testing equipment, the stability ovens capacity, and temperatures and humidities that can be conducted at. Then at the sit-down meeting, I requested stability data to review. They gave me the Australian stability data, which sort of didn't quite make the Australian TGA requirements. And when I asked for the Asia Pacific stability data, which is generally conducted under high humidity and higher temperatures, they said, Glenn, can you wait an hour? We need to retrieve this. So I waited. When they did give me the stability data up to 4 and 5 years was perfect. But from my experience, I knew that these products would not survive past 3 years because of the temperature and humidity conditions. And then I asked if the stability studies were conducted in-house or were they outsourced? And they confirmed they were all conducted in-house. So that was my second warning. in the sense that their stability ovens couldn't manage these type of conditions. They couldn't manage the capacity. They had over 1,500 export products registered, as well as local products to manage. And each product has to undergo stability testing. Okay. And then, so that was my second area of warning. The third one was I asked about the test methods and testing equipments, which they told me what equipments they used. And guess what? The laboratory didn't have those equipment. So now I was really concerned. And then they took me on a plant tour and I met a colleague and I said to my colleague, my instincts are saying not to rely on the data provided. My colleague who knew me well said, Glenn, trust your instincts. Okay. A couple of months later, TGA audited the facility and they found major deficiencies and failures in the company's manufacturing and quality control procedures, including systematic and deliberate manipulation of quality control test data. Stability is a quality control test data. So again, you know, like we always say, trust your first gut instinct. If you feel something's wrong, it usually is, right? In this case, it didn't feel right to me. I wasn't the favour in the general manager's eyes when I went back and told him I didn't recommend this company for manufacturing. But after the news came out, he said, you saved us. You saved the brand. That's my personal experience.
Personal experience with exactly what we're talking about today. Well, a couple of things you said made me think of this while you were talking. There are whistleblower protections in Australia now. Are there many instances where people blow the whistle on this sort of stuff in the pharma companies and related entities?
Not that I'm aware of in Australia, but I'm aware of a Roche whistleblower in terms of the vitamin minerals in overseas. So there was protection on that whistleblower as well. But I'm not aware of any instances in Australia.
Yeah, because I mean, there's, as we've been talking about, it's pretty obvious that you could have one person who's a bad actor, but there's so many processes around them that it would be very hard for someone to act alone. There must be some shared knowledge of some of the elements of what is going on here. And you would think, you know, that gives rise to someone blowing the whistle at some point. So it's quite interesting that that's not the experience that you've had. It also raises the question, which I might throw at Michael, maybe I could answer it, I suppose. But if you have a number of people in an organisation, or if you have a bad actor, say, who is doing some of this stuff that's leading to some of these outcomes, and they're not on the board of directors, they're in the operational part of the business, you know, there's a question around what level of knowledge might be required before other people in the business may be held accountable for what is going on. I mean, there's normal reporting that happens in businesses and things. That if someone's going to say, well, who's actually responsible for this? And I believe fraud's been committed by this company. Are the crosshairs pointed at the directors? Can they be?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, they probably can be, but I think the default position would typically be that it's the corporate entity that's going to bear the bulk of the liability. There might be circumstances where a director or officer might have some personal liability. I think that would be in instances where they have where either they are directly involved in the fraud, in the conduct, so that they've been involved in setting it up or somehow had a part to play in it, or it could be where they have sufficient knowledge, I guess, where they should have maybe stopped the conduct or done something about it. So in the case of a director, I would think that depending on the detail of information that might come up to the board, if they have knowledge, and they would probably need to have quite specific knowledge about what the conduct was, but if they had the knowledge that a fraud was committed and then they didn't do anything about it, then they might there might be some personal liability there.
Yeah.
And that, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you need to have a sufficient level of knowledge to be able to ground either an intention or, you know, reckless indifference, you know, as
Yep.
two sort of baskets of things. Now, I just want to,
Can I just add something to that? In a lot of the large multinational companies which I work with, we do have an internal process. If we know that there's something wrong, we can confidentially report it through into our legal team. So most multinational companies have their own internal legal group, and you can report it, and there'll be an investigation which is conducted confidentially, and they'll verify what the facts. So the large multinational companies do have a process internally for that company.
it sounds like smaller organisations should have something similar as well, or an external party who can get involved or something. I just want to keep exploring some of these things we're talking about, and might introduce the Theranos example at this point, that most people should know about. Blood tests that were offered for sale over in the States. There were false claims made about the effectiveness of them. Effectively, they were sold to medical practitioners, related health professionals, and money was made that way. And claims are also made in order to investors in order to raise funds, raise capital for the business. So you've got false data that was known to be false by Elizabeth Holmes and I think the COO, and then claims based on that made to various parties in order to make money, you know, putting it very simply, which is obviously very bad. Now, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years or so. I think the COO 12 plus. The reason why I want to sort of raise this, we've only got a few minutes to go, is just to explore the relationship, I suppose, between or the line between research misconduct and, you know, what we would be calling fraud. I mean, are they the same thing? And what I mean by that is the testing data that was falsely reported here is research data. What Theranos did with that information became, you know, commercial fraud, I suppose, in terms of, you know, making money out of business and other people. But really, it's the same concept, dishonesty. And Dennis, I don't know if you have anything to say about this line between research misconduct and fraud.
Yeah, so research misconduct has a tendency to be in the sort of the pre-commercial stage, if you like, falsifying, modifying data. Whereas the Theranos example is of a commercial entity raising capital from investors who are trusting the technology and the claims made by the technology, which turned out to be absolutely false. Research misconduct or misdemeanor, it's a bit difficult exactly to measure, really is in the pre-product or pre-product service arena when you're trying to establish a new direction or a new outcome, or first steps in a new therapy or device or something like that. But the Theranos example really is a fully commercial offering, attempting to attract investors, and they attracted $700 million from investors. So it's a sort of a different end of the spectrum.
So just pause it. Just looking at the research misdemeanor, let's call it that. Say that. How is that regulated in Australia?
Well, it's not regulated, not really. It's by consultation. It's by exposing, of course, the misdemeanor in the first place. And we need to be mindful of when mistakes are made in that type of assumption, that misdemeanor is in fact something else other than criminal activity. So that's very important to think about what happens when we get it wrong. And it does happen. We've got some great examples. But the research environment is very poorly regulated, particularly outside of the environment of clinical trials. Glenn has already mentioned things such as ethics committees, protocol development, data safety monitoring boards, a whole range of checks and balances that really do not exist in the lab other than research activity, good laboratory practice. If I can borrow a term, it's not the pharmaceutical good laboratory practice, it's the research good laboratory practice, and that's really quite different.
So we have a situation where research is loosely regulated, and yet the output of that research may be used by commercial entities in order to make claims to the general public, to regulators, to other people, and then for profit.
That's why it's so important to make sure of the integrity of those data as they're being generated in the lab, because everything else rests on that, and it's an incremental process over time, building up a database of information, scientific information, which may result in a product or service which could be commercially.
Yeah, and of course, once someone then enters the market with data that may not have integrity and does the wrong thing with it, there are other regulators. There's the police, and there's people can be prosecuted, and the civil claims could be brought, and all these other things that may regulate people's behaviour.
Well, the US SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, took a very punitive approach to Theranos, the example that we're talking about, because the CEO got 11 years and 3 months, custodial sentence, and the chief operating officer, I think he was, got 12 years plus custodial sentence. So that's a very different approach that we see here, actually.
Do you have any examples of what we have seen here?
Yes, so there are a few examples. And one I actually have a personal overlap with, a company called Certex. They're using technology from Dr. Bruce Gray in WA, so-called spheres. They stand for Selective Internal Radiation Therapy, a new technology particularly dedicated to helping patients, helping treat patients with liver cancer. So that started out as a laboratory investigation, scientific investigation, became a commercial entity. And when it was commercially viable, they established corporate structures, such as a CEO and so on. Well, that CEO, this is all in the public domain, was convicted by the Australian Securities Investment Commission, Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, for insider trading. And he was sentenced to a custodial sentence of 1 year and 6 months imprisonment, and was immediately released on his own recognizance of $10,000, with his sentence to be served in the community. Now, what he was doing was looking after himself to the disadvantage of the shareholders, because the shares were valued at twice the value on one day. When he knew that adverse data were coming, he engaged in this insider trading, and then the next day there was something like half the value, something like that. And there are several other examples in Australia of that.
Well, it's a good one that shows how once you have data that lacks integrity, there are many ways that can play out and be misused, because it's really just information that is being peddled by whoever's using it, and that can cause loss very easily. I note the time. We've got some other things we could talk about. Does anyone have any questions in the room? Do we have any, just as a check, anything online? Nothing online? Okay.
Oh, I can speak about that. What's the worst type of fraud you've ever seen in your history of pharmaceutical drugs being approved?
I think the worst type of fraud has been the Ranbaxy case, where they even used 1/100th scale batches for the bioequivalence studies, whereas you're only supposed to use 1/10 scale, manufacture 1/10 scale, and they only use batches which they knew would pass. And so really they truly jeopardize people's lives because we trust the medicines we take. People are price conscious, right? And so every penny counts. And in this case, they abused our trust. And Sir Isaac Newton was right in terms of what he said. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And there should be an equal opposite reaction with regards to fraud.
And when it comes to, humans and our lives, you would expect, like just looking into this from the outside, you would expect to have more oversight and more, less of a self-regulated environment. Are there any changes coming? Michael, are you aware of any changes in this area?
Yes, well, in the article that you and your colleague wrote, I learnt that there are changes coming. But yes, there are changes coming, or there's been talk about changes coming, right? So I don't know whether the changes will come, but there is certainly talk about changes coming. And a lot of that is all based around the fact that at the moment, particularly with the research misconduct, it seems to be a self-regulated and, misdemeanor or offence, right? So question then about, what do you do about it? Do you put in an independent body to regulate that and to regulate clinical trials and any research misconduct or the mishandling of data and all those sorts of things? One of the sort of downsides perhaps of doing something like that might be then that we just have another layer of regulation, another regulator in an already highly regulated industry. And does that slow down the research? Does it slow down all those businesses and all those research offices that do the right thing, then having to comply with more regulation and other things? Because at the moment, there is an enormous amount of research that goes on in Australia. There's an enormous amount of clinical trials that take place every day. And, I just sometimes wonder if we keep piling on regulation, will we get the products that we want to see coming through? That said, I understand. I mean, it's people's health.
Yeah. So where does the balance lie between oversight, integrity of these things, and red tape, cost, disencouraging or innovation?
Yeah, but I sometimes wonder. I mean, we've spoken about some of these instances, but I don't know the stats, but it would be interesting to know what the stats are, because they must be a very, very small percentage of all the research and activity that goes on. And I'd hate to see, and I think Glenn kind of mentioned this a little bit before, how just one bad actor kind of ruins the industry for everyone else who's doing the right thing.
So Glenn, Dennis, do you have any views on this aspect?
Well, I think Michael's absolutely correct that there's a lot of discussion around this, but nothing has actually ever been stood up. And I'm not aware that the concept of a third-party integrity oversight organisation, I mean, there is an official name. I've forgotten exactly what it is, but it's a proposal for such an organisation for Australian research integrity oversight.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been discussed for a long time, never been stood up. So, and I'm not aware of a time frame to stand anything up.
But I also agree with Michael in the sense that if you over-regulate, you won't have any products here. So it's a balance. It's a balance between risk and benefit. It's a balance between risk and timing, availability of the products. Because when I worked with Wellcome, we had AZT. And at that time, the process of regulations in Australia, it took 4 to 5 years to get a product approved. And the AIDS activists basically said, by the time you approve these products, we'll be dead, right? So it's a balance. It truly is a balance. And TGA is trying to balance it out in terms of the risk of these products. But I think there's a saying by Craig Lunsborough, which states ethics might be optional but the consequences are not. And it's the consequences that we need to think about in terms of what other penalties or action can be taken against these select individuals or companies which do the wrong thing, and not penalize all the companies which are trying to do the right thing.
Okay, I think that's all fair enough. We do have a couple more minutes. I wanted to ask another question about another topic, about clinical trials. I am interested in whether you think there are areas of managing clinical trials that are open to potentially manipulation, or and how are they managed by organisations?
So clinical trials are very heavily audited and very heavily regulated. They are approved by an ethics committee. They are either approved or notified to the TGA, mostly notified because there's an ethics committee involved. The protocols generally call for high level of auditing of information against source documentation. So if there is a claim about a laboratory outcome, say, or some clinical outcome, that needs to be audited against a source document. In the old days, we used to talk about individual patient data, and meaning that if there was a claim that patient A in a clinical trial had responded in this way, it was necessary for the auditor, very often the sponsor, usually the sponsor, to audit that information by looking at the source information. There's a very famous case in Melbourne of a clinical scientist who falsified clinical trial data, and the only way that could happen would be through inadequate auditing.
Okay, so having robust governance and processes is, if you're sitting at the top of the organisation or in the risk and compliance area of the organisation, is the key.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions anyone would like to ask? Because we're almost at time. Yes. Do we have a microphone? Oh, here we are. There's two coming.
Thank you. In balancing what you were saying about your concerns about there being too much red tape, do you think there's another way to balance the commercial interests involved in health innovation? Because in my mind, if it's all self-regulated and their own interests are put forward and there's no overarching body regulating, then who's to stop them only looking out for their own interests?
How do you curb the profit motive?
Well, the profit, I've been involved and I'm currently involved with a startup biotech. And I can assure you, as an opportunity approaches a commercial inflection point, people lose their minds and their values. It's a very significant issue. In terms of, well, all of the companies, I was about to say just the publicly listed ones, but public unlisted that we have hybrid here in this country, and private companies, although there's a different level of reporting, there's still oversight but it's a very blunt instrument. So if you're looking for the piece of information which has been fraudulently claimed, it would be very difficult to ascertain that right approximate in time to when that happened. You'd be looking sort of down the track. ASIC is an example, and then there are criminal sanctions and so on. But it's all it's really quite difficult. It all comes back to integrity and reputation, taking a punt on the majority of people doing the right thing for the majority of the time, and then jumping on infractions, when they occur.
Relying on human nature sounds very risky to me.
piggybacking off that, does the commercialisation of our tertiary education sector, compared to where it was, say, 15, 20 years ago, give rise to a greater risk of fraud as research is, increasingly has a commercial value to it, as opposed to being, formerly it would have been conducted by the Commonwealth, say, the Commonwealth laboratories, services or whatnot?
So Zach, I'm not sure if it's the education element you're thinking of. Well, I'm not sure that this firm would be too astonished about the performance of research activities in the major innovation centres in the country, meaning the universities, the research centres and the medical research institutes. There is a tendency for it to be quite poorly coordinated, diffuse in terms of its focus, and I'm not aware of an imperative that relates to different moral outcomes, if you like, because of additional commerciality or third-party commercial organisations becoming involved in their universities, let's say. I'm not aware of that, and I would posit that it's probably difficult to achieve in any event. The research activities are what they are, that we have discussed and so on. When you see an infraction, it's jumped on, it's queried, reputations are compromised, and it's very important also to consider when people get it wrong. But I don't authentically know the answer to that. I don't know that it's been measured.
I think it's always been a case that for researchers, publishing papers and having research has always been their currency. That's what it helps them attract, new funding for new projects and new research. So that has always been around. And I guess that temptation perhaps to, manipulate, I guess, has always been there the whole time. And I like to think that most people would do the right thing because they're more concerned about their reputation. And the same would go like for all the research institutes and the universities in Australia. All the people who are doing clinical trials rely very heavily on their reputation to get funding and to get people interested in their products or the research that they're doing. That, in a way, can be a two-edged sword because it means then that they might do anything to protect their reputation, like to, bury some fraudulent activity or research misconduct. So I appreciate that. Maybe one thing, although I'm not quite sure how it would work because I'm just thinking it now off the top of my head, but maybe they could have some kind of a bit more transparency about when these sorts of things happen, just so that the public or the greater community kind of know, because we all know that it probably does happen, but we would like to see that it's being dealt with in a proper way. So maybe there could be more transparency, perhaps, but I'm not quite sure how that would work.
Okay, I think we had another question.
I was wondering if any of you could comment on AI and AI generated data and data integrity in clinical trials and medical, especially in the medical world and in health.
Thought you got it away without having to deal with that.
Do you want to repeat the question? Well, I would just say that using AI, you need to be very careful, regardless of whether you're in research, but I would be particularly more careful about using it in research. Just, you'd have to be very sure that the data set on which you're applying the model to, or the AI agent, is accurate, because otherwise you're going to get some pretty distorted results. So I'm not sure whether that's what you're kind of talking about, but Yeah, no, I'm not aware, although I'm not necessarily would be aware, but I'm not aware of any people, trying to use AI in that way. But I can understand that it would be, it's probably something that people are looking at doing, if not they already have done, because I guess you could use AI to analyse the data and to draw some conclusions, but you'd have to, again, through audit and through other processes, try and check that the outcomes that AI is coming up with are accurate. I don't know whether Glenn and Dennis might have something.
Look, I'm definitely not expert in this field, but the only thing that I can think of in terms of a response is that all tools that relate to clinical trials need to be regulated. So, software for electronic data capture, for example, needs to be regulated and approved. I guess, but I don't have enough knowledge, anonymous AI inclusion could be the big issue. But otherwise, if there was an AI tool that was significantly important in a future clinical trial environment, then the regulators would need to see it, review it, and approve it.
That makes sense.
Or has to be validated as well. I do know of one instance, and I'm trying to remember the medical condition, where the researchers have been following various paths to solve this medical condition. And they always thought about this other pathway, but never really pursued it. And when they put all that data into AI, the AI actually generated and agreed that this pathway they never investigated is the option to possibly treating the medical condition. So now the researchers are looking at that option. So AI can be a helpful tool, but AI can also be, you can't believe everything that it generates. Because I know from a regulatory experience where I've put some information in to find the regulatory pathway for a specific product, I got an answer which wasn't totally correct from my experience, which is saying it's not 100% validated.
Is it the issue with AI generation similar to what we're seeing in the banking fraud cases where source documents are being artificially engineered? And so when you're looking at the source data for your documentation and you're relying on that for your audit, potentially from a third-party manufacturer overseas who's generating this information through AI, which looks to be completely legitimate, that's really where the risk arises. And knowing that that's the environment that we find ourselves in, and knowing that there's a incentive for research to be conducted in Australia with R&D grants, is it time for the government to say, well, we need to wind back some of that to increase more scrutiny to avoid potential concerns around the data which is being used in those tests? And part of the rebates which you get for your R&D grants in Australia could be better used to regulate the system to ensure that those things don't fall within the cracks.
Wow.
That's the last question.
Adam, I'm not sure how to respond to that, but it occurred to me immediately that if there's an AI-generated source document, that is an issue. But what happens with the utility of that information is potentially an even bigger one. So look, I don't know the answer to your question and how to manage that. I'm not sure that that's been thoroughly thought through, unless Michael knows. But I can't respond to it.
I'm not sure whether I'll answer the question, but I'll say, I mean, one of the things with data, particularly in research, is and auditors and people who are trying to validate will be looking for is to make sure that the data can be replicated. And by that, I mean that, similar kind of tests can be done somewhere else and you get the similar kind of result. So if it has been just data that has been fabricated, which I think is what you're saying, then hopefully somewhere in the chain of the research and the data being provided, someone, goes to try and replicate the data in similar conditions and finds out that it's been fabricated and false.
And adding to what Michael just said, under the registration process, when you're doing clinical trials to gain registration, you have to produce 2 studies, large studies, which validates the study findings. Okay, you can have one study which shows a statistical insignificance, which means it wasn't important. If that happens, you just generate another larger study to demonstrate the data was true and it wasn't a statistical flaw.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Now, that is all we have time for. Appreciate your attention. Refreshments await. So can I ask you all to join me in thanking our panel?